Welcome back to the channel. We are diving deep today, and I mean really deep.
Oh, this one is?
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Seriously. Imagine the year is 1655. We're in the Caribbean. The heat is, shimmering off the water. And this massive English fleet, huge wooden ship, sails, billowing, cannons already, has just pulled up to the shores of Jamaica.
This is Cromwell's grand plan, the Western design.
Right. And they land, they storm the beaches, they kick out the Spanish, and they plant the Union Jack. In their minds, they've done it. They've just conquered Jamaica.
It's the classic colonial playbook. They look at the map, they see the coastline, the ports, and they just assume dominion. They tell themselves, this is ours now. We own this.
But here's the hook, and this is what we are really diving into today. They were completely, fundamentally wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Because while the English were busy celebrating on the coast, popping champagne, or maybe rum, I guess, at that point, something else was happening. Something silent. And for the empire, something terrifying.
The interior. It was a different world entirely, a different reality.
Hundreds of people, Africans, were just vanishing, disappearing into the mist. And they weren't just hiding, they were building something that would eventually force the mighty British Empire to its knees.
It's such a fascinating moment in history because you have these two parallel realities forming at the exact same time. On the coast, you've got the colonial machines starting to churn sugar, slavery, profits. That's the story we usually hear.
Yeah, the one in the textbook.
Exactly. But up in the mountains, you have this counter-narrative being born. Groups of people are vanishing into the interior to build something new. Some of them had actually been freed by the retreating Spaniards, specifically to be a thorn in the side of the English.
So like a parting gift.
A parting gift, yeah. A guerrilla force left behind. Others were escaping from the brand new English plantations. But the key insight here, and if you take one thing away from the first few minutes led up to this, is that they didn't just vanish to hide, they vanished to build.
And that is our deep dive mission for today.
We're going into the mountains, into the history, and honestly, into the very soul of resistance.
Absolutely.
You are listening to the ABENG Signal, and this is a special deep dive. We're calling it Mountain Kingdoms. They are.
And we're focusing on what the series history calls Episode 7, Nanny, Cudjoe, and the First Maroon War.
It's a massive topic.
It is, and frankly, it's one of the most remarkable stories, not just in Caribbean history, but I would argue in global military history.
How so?
Well, it's a story about how a group of people against absolutely impossible odds, forced a global superpower to its knees. We aren't just talking about runaways. I think that term is just too passive, It implies fear, hiding.
It's a colonial term.
It is. We are talking about the formation of a Black Mountain nation. We are talking about the Maroons.
Precisely. And the definitions here really, really matter. The British called them Maroons. We need to get our definitions straight.
Yeah, that's important.
We throw this word around a lot, maroon. Who exactly are we talking about here? Because I think a lot of people just hear runaway slave and, they move on.
And that is a huge misconception. If you just think of them as runaways, you miss the entire political reality of who they were.
Okay, so break it down.
The term maroon actually connects back to the Spanish period, before the British even arrived in 1655. The root word is cimarron.
Which is Spanish.
Yes, and it implies something wild, untamed, living on the peaks. Originally, it was a term they used for cattle that had escaped the pen and returned to a natural, fierce state up in the hills.
So it's almost a badge of honor then, untamed, unbroken. But if you shift your perspective, if you look at it from the mountains looking down, they didn't see themselves as rebels or runaways. They saw themselves as a free people. They were defending their land, their spirit, and their absolute right to exist.
It's just amazing when you think about it. You have this hidden kingdom growing, literally right under the nose of the British Empire. Yeah. And for the longest time, the British, they couldn't solve it.
They couldn't solve it because they couldn't even begin to understand it.
Yeah.
So this deep dive is going to cover the period from, let's say, roughly 1670 up to 1739. We're calling this Mountain Kingdoms guy.
And we're going to get into the legendary leaders, right? Nanny and Cudjoe.
Oh, absolutely. We have to. We'll look at them. We'll look at the First Maroon War itself, and then ultimately we have to look at the Treaty of 1739.
That treaty, yeah. That's a really complex piece of paper.
It is the pivot point of this entire story. It represents incredible military genius, strategy, survival, but it also contains a clause, a very painful clause that we're going to have to spend some real time unpacking later on.
So what does this all mean for us today? Why dive into this particular story?
Because it's a story of survival, of asymmetrical warfare, and high-stakes diplomacy that, frankly, feels like a movie script. But it was real, and more importantly, it challenges the standard narrative. We usually hear about the colonial powers just dominating everything in their path. This story flips that completely on its head. This is the story of the empire getting checkmated by people they considered property.
Okay, so let's jump in. Chapter 1. We need to go back to the late 1600s. You said earlier that these weren't just individuals hiding in caves. I think a lot of people have this cartoonish idea of a runaway just sitting alone under a tree, scared.
Right, and the source material paints a completely different picture. It was an evolution. That's the crucial part to understand here.
An evolution.
Yeah. In the immediate aftermath of 1655, sure, you had small bands, you had chaos, people just trying to survive day to day. But over the decades, as we move into the late 1600s and early 1700s, these scattered groups began to coalesce. They went from runaways to organized communities.
Organized how? I mean, what does that actually look like on the ground?
It looks like a society in every way that matters. First, and most importantly, you have to eat. You cannot fight a war against a global superpower if you're starving. So they established extensive agriculture.
So they're farming in the mountains.
They're farming. They're clearing land in hidden valleys, growing crops, plantains, yams, cocoa, all sorts of things to sustain a growing population.
You know, that implies such stability.
Yeah.
You don't plant cocoa trees if you think you're going to have to run away tomorrow. That's a long-term investment.
That's precisely the point. They were digging in, they were there to stay. Then they established defense lines. They created codes of discipline and justice.
Wait, codes of justice, so like laws?
Absolutely. This wasn't a free-for-all. To survive in that environment with that level of constant external threat, you need strict social cohesion. You need a hierarchy. You need rules. And you need consequences if you break them.
And this all connects back to what you said about the Spanish, right? Because some of these people, they weren't new to this.
Yes, this is a vital connection to make. When the English took over, the Spanish didn't just leave an empty island. The Africans who had been with the Spanish, some enslaved, some already free, they already knew the terrain. They possessed what you could call mountain knowledge.
Mountain knowledge. I love that phrase. Break that down for us. Is that just like knowing where the good caves are?
It's the difference between life and death. It's knowing where the freshwater springs are in a limestone landscape that just sucks water straight underground.
Right.
It's knowing which plants are edible and which ones will kill you. It's knowing how to navigate these razor-sharp ridges without falling. So when new runaways escaped from the English plantations and somehow made it to the mountains, they weren't starting from scratch. They were joining a group that already had this deep institutional knowledge.
They were stepping into a legacy of survival.
Exactly. It had been passed down and was being refined every single day.
So it's not a side story in Jamaican history.
No. And that's the argument our source material makes very, very strongly. This is not a footnote. The survival and the state building of the Maroons is central to the history of Jamaica. It completely challenges the idea of total British dominance.
Because there was never a moment where the British truly held 100% of the island.
Never. There was always this sovereign, defiant space in the interior, a space they couldn't conquer.
Which brings us to the where. Because you can't have a mountain kingdom without the mountains. And the geography here, I mean, I've seen pictures of the Jamaican interior. It's rugged.
Rugged is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
The geography is basically a third participant in this war. It's not just the Maroons versus the British, it's the Maroons and the land versus the British.
So to understand their success, you have to understand the ground they were fighting on.
You have to. And there were two main strongholds. In the west, you had the Leeward Maroons, and they inhabited the Cockpit country.
Cockpit country, what a name.
And in the east, you had the Windward Maroons up in the Blue Mountains. Two very different environments, but both were natural fortresses.
Okay, so let's break those down. Cockpit country. It sounds terrifying just from the name. What are we actually looking at?
Imagine a geological nightmare for an invading army. It's what geologists call karst terrain.
Right.
Karst. Basically, picture a massive block of limestone that's been eroded by acidic rainwater over millions and millions of years. What it creates are these deep, bowl-shaped depressions. Those are the cockpits. And they're separated by these incredibly steep, jagged ridges.
I saw someone describe it as like an egg carton made of razor blades.
That's a very vivid way to put it. And pretty accurate. It's full of sinkholes, caves that go on for miles, and just dense, tangled vegetation. There are almost no straight lines.
So if you don't know the path.
If you don't know the path, you aren't just lost. You are physically trapped. A British soldier in his stiff leather boots is going to twist an ankle within 10 minutes or worse.
And then on the other side of the island, you have the Blue Mountains.
A completely different kind of fortress. This isn't about limestone sinkholes. This is about elevation. We're talking peaks rising over 7,000 feet, steep, sheer slopes. And it's constantly shrouded in clouds, mist, rain. It's cold up there. It's a vertical world.
So the source material describes this geography as their armor.
It was their armor. It was natural fortress architecture. And we have to visualize this to really get it.
Okay, paint the picture.
All right, imagine you are a British soldier. You've just arrived from England. You're wearing a bright red uniform made of heavy wool.
In the tropics.
In the tropics, because the British Army loves its wool. You're carrying a heavy musket, ammunition, your rations, and you're used to fighting in the open fields of Europe, where armies line up in nice, neat rows.
Now you're being marched into the cockpit country. It's 90 degrees, 100% humidity.
Exactly. You're stumbling over limestone that's literally cutting your boots to ribbons. You're sweating through your wool uniform. You're slipping into sinkholes you can't see. Mosquitoes are eating you alive. And the whole time, you feel like you're being watched.
Because you are.
Because you absolutely are. And that image, the idea of the invisible eyes, that gives me chills. The Maroons used this landscape as a shield, as protection, because they knew the secrets of the rocks and the forests. They knew how to move silently through it. They knew how to use the terrain to funnel the British soldiers into choke points, into kill zones. The geography did half the fighting for them.
It reminds me of that saying, don't fight a land war in Asia. But in this case, it's don't fight a mountain war in Jamaica if you don't know the mountains.
And don't fight a war against people who consider those mountains their spiritual home.
Which is the perfect segue. Because rocks and ridges don't fight wars on their own. People do. And the Maroons had two, giants of history leading them. Nanny and Cudjoe.
Two very different figures, but both absolutely essential to the survival of their people.
Let's start with Queen Nanny of the Windward Maroons. I mean, even her name today carries so much weight in Jamaican culture. She's a national hero.
She is, and Nanny is a figure who really transcends the simple label of military leader. She's described as the mother of a nation. She was a warrior, yes, without a doubt, but she was also a priestess, a spiritual leader.
And her origins, she was likely a Sante, right? From modern-day Ghana.
That's what the scholarship suggests, yes. She brought that Akan heritage, that military and spiritual tradition, with her.
The source mentions these incredible legends about her, specifically the bullet catching.
Yes. The oral histories, which are so important here, are very specific about this. They say that Nanny could catch British bullets.
With her hands.
Sometimes with her hands, sometimes, as the legend goes, with her buttocks. And then she would spit them back at the enemy.
Wow. Okay, so obviously that's a legend, but looking at this through a historical lens, what does a legend like that tell us about her and her leadership?
It tells us she was viewed as invincible. It tells us that her people believed she possessed a spiritual protection that was far stronger than British gunpowder. It speaks directly to the role of Obia.
Obia. We need to define that in this context because I think it's often misunderstood or sensationalized.
Right. It's not just black magic. In this context, Odeya refers to the whole system of spiritual practices, the ritual preparation for battle, the connection to the ancestors, the use of herbal medicine and charms. It was a spiritual technology.
So Nanny wasn't just giving tactical orders on where to march.
No, she was conducting rituals. She was preparing her warriors psychologically and spiritually for battle. So when a Maroon warrior went into a fight, he didn't just feel like he had a spear or maybe a stolen musket. He felt he had spiritual armor on.
And that's a force multiplier.
A massive one. If you believe you cannot be defeated, you fight differently. You fight with a different kind of courage.
But she also had this domestic role, right? The source says she led her people through hunger.
Yes, and this is crucial. You have to remember, when you're at war, your supply lines get cut. The British were constantly trying to find and burn their farms to starve them out. Nanny is credited with keeping the community fed. There is another legend about Nanny's pot, a pot that would seemingly never run empty, always multiplying food.
So it's a metaphor for her role as the sustainer.
It represents her role as the provider, the mother who protects and nourishes her children at all costs. But she was also fierce. There are accounts that suggest she was actually more militant than some of the male leaders. She was less willing to negotiate with the British. She was an absolutist when it came to freedom.
Which brings us to the other side of the island, to the Leeward Maroons and to Cudjoe.
Cudjoe, he's the perfect counterweight. If Nanny is this burning spiritual fire, Cudjoe is the grand strategist, the diplomat, the general.
The source describes him as disciplined.
Extremely. Cudjoe's genius was organization. He managed to hold together a confederation of different Maroon groups in the Cockpit country, and you have to remember, the Maroons weren't a monolith. They were people from different African ethnic groups, Coromantee, Igbo, Congo. They had different languages, different customs. There were internal tensions, rivalries.
It's a full-time job in itself.
Yep.
It's keeping everyone on the same page without a formal government structure.
And doing it while being hunted relentlessly by the British Empire, Cudjoe had this incredible ability to maintain strict discipline under that constant pressure. He understood, fundamentally, that if they fractured, they would die.
So his leadership was all about strategy, unity, and pragmatic survival.
Exactly. He was the anchor.
So you have Nanny providing the spiritual ferocity and uncompromising will in the East, and Cudjoe providing the strategic organization and discipline in the West.
And together, even though they operated independently, they presented a completely unsolvable problem for the British.
Which leads us right into the war itself, the First Maroon War. We're talking, roughly the 1720s and 30s now? This is when things really heat up.
Yeah, this is when the British decide they are done ignoring the problem. The planters on the coast are screaming at the governor in Spanish Town.
Why? What's happening?
They're losing money. A lot of money. Sugar is king, remember. But sugar plantations need absolute stability to be profitable, and the Maroons are creating chaos. Enslaved people are escaping to the mountains in greater numbers. Maroon raiding parties are sweeping down from the hills at night, burning cane fields, liberating other enslaved people, and taking supplies.
When London authorizes a search.
They pour money and troops into Jamaica. They are going to crush this rebellion once and for all.
But they walked right into a buzzsaw. The source calls it asymmetrical warfare.
Or bush warfare. And this is where the Maroons' genius for tactics really shone. They didn't fight like Europeans. They would never stand in lines on an open field. That would be suicide.
So what did they do?
They used communication as a weapon. They used the ABENG.
The ABENG, that's the cow horn.
It is a cow horn, yes, with a hole blown into the side so you can use it like a trumpet. But calling it just a horn really simplifies what it was. It was a sophisticated communication network.
Not just for making noise to scare them. No. They had codes, tonal languages. They could mimic the patterns of West African tonal languages like Twi.
So it's like Morse code, but with sound.
A similar concept, yeah, but sonic and much, much faster. They could signal complex messages over long distances, bouncing the sound across the valleys. They could tell each other exactly how many British soldiers were coming, what kind of weapons they had, which direction they were moving.
That is just incredible. So the British are hacking their way through the jungle, sweating, thinking they're being sneaky.
And the entire Maroon network already knows everything about them because the hills are literally talking.
And the British can't understand the language.
Not at all. And that added to the psychological terror. Imagine it. You're in this alien landscape and you hear this mournful, loud sound echoing off the canyon walls. Woo! And you know it means you've been spotted, but you look around and you see nothing. Nothing but trees and rocks.
And then on top of that, there's the camouflage.
The art of blending in. The Maroons would cover themselves in leaves and branches with mud. They practiced absolute stillness. A British scout could walk within 5 feet of a Maroon warrior and never ever see him.
Until it was too late.
Until the machete came down.
Ambush. That seems to be the key tactic here.
It was their bread and butter, turning the environment itself into a weapon. They would never attack the main British force head on. They would wait. They'd wait until the British column was stretched out on some narrow single-file path in the Cockpit country. Then they would attack the rear, or snipe the officers from the cliffs above, create chaos, strike hard, and then just vanish back into the bush.
It sounds absolutely exhausting to fight against.
It was worse than exhausting. It was demoralizing. The British soldiers were terrified. They started getting sick, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. They were dying more from disease than from combat.
So what was the British response to this? They must have tried to adapt.
They did. They built a series of forts to try to contain the Maroons. They sent out specialized hunting parties. They even imported trackers, mosquito Indians from Central America, because they finally realized that white soldiers were useless at tracking in that jungle.
And did any of it work?
Not really. I mean, they had some skirmishes. They found and burned some of the Maroon towns. They actually captured the famous Nanny town at one point, but they couldn't destroy the Maroon presence.
They just rebuild.
The Maroons would just burn the town themselves and move deeper into the hills where the British couldn't follow. The source describes the result for the British as a brutal, expensive war.
And expensive is the word that empires hate the most.
That's the thing. Empires run on ledgers. At the end of the day, it's about profit and loss, and money and men were simply disappearing into the bush. The cost of maintaining the regiments in Jamaica was skyrocketing. The Jamaica Assembly was going broke, and for what? They weren't gaining any territory, they were just losing men.
So it was basically a stalemate.
It was worse than a stalemate for the British. It was a humiliation. Here is this global superpower, with the best navy and arguably the best army in the world, being fought to a standstill by, in their view, a ragtag group of escaped slaves with inferior weaponry, but superior tactics, superior knowledge of the land, and a superior will to fight. They realized they could not win militarily.
And when you can't win with guns.
You have to do.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, the Treaty, 1739.
The moment the empire blinked.
So the British sue for peace. They basically admit they can't win. They decide they have to sit down and negotiate with Cudjoe. Set the scene for us. This wasn't happening in some palace in London.
No, this was in the bush. Colonel Guthrie, the British commander, had to march his men out to meet Cudjoe near his camp. It was incredibly tense.
I can imagine.
Both sides were heavily armed. The Maroons vastly outnumbered the British party, and they were hidden, watching from the trees. There's this famous description of Cudjoe finally coming out to meet Guthrie. He's described as a short man, very muscular, with a wild appearance, but carrying himself with this immense dignity and authority.
And they actually signed a peace deal. I mean, that is a massive victory in itself, isn't it? Just getting the British Empire to the table as an equal.
Absolutely. It forced the empire to sign a treaty on Maroon terms, or at least on terms that the Maroons were willing to accept. It was a negotiation between two military powers.
So let's look at the terms of victory first. What did the Maroons get out of this deal? What did they win?
They won a lot. First, and this is the big one, official recognition of their freedom. The British Empire, in writing, acknowledged that these people were free. In a colony built entirely on the legal framework of slavery, that is a seismic admission.
That's huge.
Second, land grants. They were given territorial autonomy. The land they lived on, specifically 1,500 acres for Cudjoe's people in the Cockpit country, was officially theirs. It was no longer a hideout. It was a recognized territory. Maroon land.
And they got to keep their weapons.
Yes, the right to bear arms, which is practically unheard of. Usually, if a colonial power makes peace with a quote-unquote rebel group, the very first thing they demand is hand over your gun.
Right. Disarmament.
The Maroons kept theirs. They maintained their military structure. They were a self-governing, armed, free community.
So on paper, this looks like a total 100% slam dunk. Freedom, land, guns, but.
But
There's always a but, isn't there?
in history, there's almost always a but. There is the painful clause, and this is the part of the history that is by far the most controversial, the most debated, and the most emotional, even to this day.
Okay, let's get right into it. What was the compromise? What do they have to give up?
In exchange for their freedom and their land, the Maroons agreed to two major concessions. One, they would help the British defend the island against foreign invasion, say from the Spanish or the French. That's pretty standard.
Okay.
But two, and this is the kicker, they agreed to capture and return any future runaways to the British.
Whoa. Let me make sure I understand that. So if I'm an enslaved person on a plantation in 1740, a year after the treaty, and I managed to escape and run to the Maroons thinking, these are my people, these free black people will save me.
Under the terms of the treaty, the Maroons were obligated to catch you, put you in cuffs, and march you back down the mountain to the plantation you just escaped from.
That is heavy. That feels like a betrayal.
It is incredibly heavy, and it completely reshaped the relationship between the Maroons and the much larger enslaved population remaining on the plantations. It created a deep and bitter divide. The Maroons became, in a sense, a colonial police force in exchange for their own autonomy.
Why? Why would Cudjoe sign that? From our perspective now, it's so easy to call him a sellout.
It is, and this is the deep dive discussion we really need to have. It's easy to judge from the comfort of the 21st century. We have to try to understand the context of 1739. The Maroons had been fighting for decades. They were tired.
They must have been exhausted.
Their food supplies were constantly being threatened. The British, despite their failures, were getting better at finding them. Their children were growing up in a perpetual war zone. They were losing people.
So it was a survival choice.
It was a choice born of brutal pragmatism. You could call it lifeboat ethics. They secured the boat for the people who were already in it. Cudjoe looked at the situation and perhaps thought, we cannot save everyone. The war for total liberation of the island is not one we can win. If we keep fighting, eventually the British might overwhelm us with sheer numbers and then everyone is re-enslaved or killed. But if we sign this treaty, at least we survive. At least our children will be born free. At least our culture survives.
It's that classic impossible moral dilemma. Do you save the few for certain at the expense of the many? Or do you risk everyone for the small chance of saving everyone?
Exactly. And historically, we see this happen in resistance movements all over the world. A peace deal is signed that cements the gains of the fighters, but often leaves others behind. It's the painful compromise of war.
It reminds me of what we discussed earlier about the difference between Nanny and Cudjoe. Did Nanny agree to this? How did she feel about it?
That is a fantastic question. And the historical record suggests that Nanny and the Windward Maroons were much more resistant to these peace terms than Cudjoe was.
They held out longer.
She didn't trust the British, and she was likely horrified by the runaway clause. There's evidence of tension there. But eventually, a similar treaty was signed with them too. But it's part of why Nanny's legacy is seen as, perhaps, purer in the eyes of many. She represented that uncompromising spirit of total freedom.
So this moves us into that final emotional reflection, the real cost of survival.
It's the moral complexity of history. It's messy. We want our heroes to be perfect. We want the victory to be clean and total. But the Maroon victory was messy. It was compromised.
But despite that compromise, they did create something utterly unique, didn't they?
They absolutely did. They created a Black nation within a slave colony. And that is profound. Think about it from the perspective of an enslaved person on a plantation. Even if you knew the Maroons might have to send you back, just knowing they existed up there.
Just the idea of them.
The idea of them, knowing there were free, armed Black people up there in the mountains who the British could not conquer, that had to have a massive psychological impact.
It completely breaks the myth of white supremacy. It breaks the myth of British invincibility that the whole system of slavery relies on.
Precisely. And it forced the empire to treat them as equals, at least diplomatically. They sat across a table from them and signed a paper. That act alone is revolutionary. It was proof that African resistance could succeed on a massive scale.
It's a legacy that is still very much alive in Jamaica today, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Maroon communities still exist. You can go to Akampong, which Cudjoe founded, or Moortown, which is associated with Nanny. They still have their land. They still have a degree of autonomy. They have their own leaders, their own colonels. The Treaty of 1739 is still cited in legal disputes today.
So they're like a state within a state.
In many ways, yes. That lineage of freedom, bought with blood and compromise, remains unbroken.
It's just incredible when you trace it all the way back. From a handful of people vanishing into the mist in 1655, to a recognized sovereign power in 1739, to a living, breathing community in the 21st century.
It is one of the great and most complex stories of resistance in human history. It's the story of how a small group of people used the land, their wits, and their spirit to defy an empire.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just look back at the journey we've taken.
We started with scattered fugitives, people vanishing into the mist, blowing the ABENG as a warning.
We saw them transform from runaways into a disciplined, organized society. We saw them use the jagged rocks of the Cockpit country and the high peaks of the Blue Mountains as their fortress.
We met the leaders Cudjoe with his pragmatic strategy, Nanny with her spiritual fire. We saw them fight the most powerful empire on earth to a standstill, using bush warfare and superior intelligence.
And finally, we saw them force that empire to the negotiating table. They signed a treaty that acknowledged their freedom and their land,
but bound them to the colonial system in a complicated, painful way.
It's the story of the birth of a state within a state, a mountain kingdom that defied the map of the British Empire.
And that treaty, with all its triumphs and all its flaws, really set the stage for everything that came after. It solidified the Maroons as a permanent power player in Jamaica.
Which is the perfect tease for what's coming next in the series, because the story doesn't end in 1740. Not by a long shot.
The ink on the paper is just the beginning of a new chapter.
Exactly. That treaty set up a whole new set of tensions. How does this state within a state actually function as time moved on? What happens when the next generation of Maroons has to deal with the British?
That is exactly what we are going to explore in episode 8. The peace was fragile, and the history only gets more intense from here.
The signal keeps going.
Absolutely.
I want to leave our listener with one final thought. We talked a lot about the ABENG, that horn.
The signal.
The ABENG signal. It was a call to resistance. It was a way of speaking that the oppressor couldn't understand. And in a way, this entire story is an ABENG signal. It's a message sent to us from the past that says, we were here, we fought, we survived, and we did it on our own terms.
And that signal still echoes through history. It's a reminder that even against the greatest odds, against the biggest empires, people can carve out a space for their own freedom.
Powerful stuff. This has been an incredible look into the Mountain Kingdoms. And for all of you listening, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uploads. Let's keep the signal strong.
See you on the next episode.
Bye. See you on the next episode.